Have you ever stood in a place so old and so saturated with misery that it feels like the walls have memorized it? Not just remembered, but memorized, like a poem it recites to itself in the dark. I have. I used to think it was just a feeling, an overactive imagination fueled by peeling paint and dust motes dancing in flashlight beams. I don't think that anymore. I know now that some places don't just hold memories, they hold a consciousness, and the one I visited learned my name. My hobby, back then, was urban exploration. I wasn't a vandal or a thrill seeker in the traditional sense. I was a historian of forgotten things. I loved the silence of abandoned buildings, the stories left behind in a discarded shoe or a calendar still flipped to a forgotten month. My target was the Blackwood Pines Sanatorium, a sprawling relic deep in the woods that had been left to rot for 50 years. It was the white whale for explorers in my area, infamous for its bad vibes and local legends of spectral patients. I brushed it all off as campfire stories. My friend Marc was supposed to come with me, but he bailed at the last minute, citing a family emergency that I suspected was actually just a healthy dose of fear. I was arrogant. I figured it was his loss. Going alone meant I could take my time, soak in the atmosphere without interruption. I had my camera, a powerful flashlight, and a crowbar for any stubborn doors. I thought I was prepared for anything. The word prepared is a joke to a place like that. I found the building at the end of an overgrown service road, a skeletal giant of brick and slate being slowly devoured by the forest. Prying open the main entrance doors took all my strength. The wood swollen and warped. The moment I stepped inside, the air changed. It was heavy, still, and cold, carrying a sterile scent I couldn't place, like ancient chemicals. The doors, which had fought me so hard, swung shut behind me with a deafening boom that echoed through the vast, dark lobby. I spun around, my heart pounding. The wind, I told myself. It had to be the wind, but there wasn't a draft. Not a single leaf stirred on the floor. I pushed the thought down and moved deeper inside. The grand staircase was rotted through in places, so I stuck to the ground floor, my flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. I explored the old administrative offices, papers and patient files carpeting the floor like dry leaves. In the dining hall, upturned tables lay like sleeping animals. It was all beautifully decayed, exactly what I'd come for. Then I heard the first sound that I couldn't explain away. From the floor directly above me, a faint, rhythmic squeaking began. Squeak, roll, squeak, roll. It was the sound of a single rusted wheel turning slowly, like someone was pushing a medical cart or an old gurney down the hallway. I froze, listening. It continued for half a minute, tracing a path from one end of the hall to the other, before simply stopping. The silence that followed was somehow louder. Against my better judgment, I decided to find a safe way to the second floor. I found a sturdy-looking back staircase and made my way up, my footsteps unnervingly loud. The second floor housed the patient wards. Long, dark corridors stretched out, lined with identical doorways. I walked the length of the hall where I'd heard the sound. It was empty. All the gurneys were pushed up against the walls, thick with dust, their wheels frozen with rust. None of them could have moved. As I stood there, trying to reason it out, a smell hit me. It was sharp antiseptic, the unmistakable odor of a hospital. It grew stronger as I approached one particular room, so strong it made my eyes water. I shone my light inside. It was just another empty room, identical to the others, but the air was thick with that clinical smell. I took one step back out of the doorway, and it was gone, completely. The air in the hall was just musty and old again. My skin crawled. It felt like the building was toying with me, showing me things that weren't there, making me question my own senses. I should have left then. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn back, to get out into the sunlight. But a morbid curiosity, the explorer's curse, pushed me forward. I wanted to see the operating theaters. I found them in the West Wing. They were surprisingly well preserved. A massive surgical lamp hung over a rusted operating table, like a metal cyclops. Instruments lay scattered on trays, glinting in my light. I was taking a photo of the table when I felt a distinct, icy cold spot in the room. It was more than a draft. It was a profound absence of heat that felt like it was sinking into my bones. I backed away, sweeping my light across the room, and that's when I saw the reflection in the observation window gallery above. For a fraction of a second, my light had caught the silhouette of a head and shoulders, a shape looking down at me before it pulled back into the darkness. I yelled out, a stupid, reflexive "Who's there?" The only answer was the echo of my own voice, mocking me. That was it. I was done. I turned and ran, not even caring which way I was going, just needing to get out. I barreled down a hallway, hadn't been in before, and came to a set of double doors with faded paint on the glass. The sunlight ward. The children's wing. The air in here was different, heavier, sadder. The walls were covered in faded murals of cartoon animals whose painted smiles looked like grotesque sneers in the gloom. And then I saw the handprints. On the dusty pane of a large window overlooking the dead grounds, there were dozens of small, children's handprints. They weren't old and faded. They were sharp, clear, as if they'd been made just moments ago in the thick layer of dust. My breath hitched. From a dark corner of the room, something rolled silently across the floor and came to a perfect stop, touching the tip of my boot. I looked down. It was a single, blue glass marble. My mind just broke. I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe. I just turned and fled. I sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors, my own panicked gasps chasing me. I finally saw the faint outline of the main entrance doors and threw my entire body against them. They burst open, and I fell out onto the dead leaves, gulping in the clean, evening air. I scrambled back to my car, my lungs burning, not daring to look back at the dark, silent building that seemed to be watching me go. I never went back. I sold my camera gear and packed away my maps. The silence of my own home became my enemy, because sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, in the dead quiet of the night, I hear it. From the empty room down the hall, a faint, familiar sound. Squeak, roll, squeak, roll. But this time, it's not a gurney. It's the sound of a single, blue glass marble, rolling slowly across the wooden floor. Most people think of silence as an absence of sound, but it isn't. True silence, absolute silence, is something our brains are not equipped to handle. If you find a place that is truly, perfectly quiet, your mind will invent sounds to fill the void. I know this because I went looking for that perfect quiet. I was a fool. I thought I was searching for an absence, but what I found was a presence. A sound that had been waiting in the silence for a very, very long time. By trade, I was a sound artist. I didn't compose music. I captured atmospheres. I would travel to the most remote places on Earth, volcanic deserts, ancient forests, glacial caves, and record their unique audio signatures. My goal was to find the sound of a world without us. A friend in the armed forces told me about an ideal candidate. An abandoned DEW-line station in the far northern territories, designated only as Site B, built during the Cold War to watch for Soviet bombers. It had been decommissioned in the late 80s and left to the merciless elements. It was miles from any town, accessible only by a long, arduous hike. It was perfect. The thought of capturing the pure, unpolluted sound of wind moving over decaying radar domes filled me with an almost religious excitement. I packed my best, gear binaural microphones, a multi-track field recorder, noise-oscillating headphones, worth more than my car, and spent 2 days trekking into that vast, empty landscape. When I finally saw it on the horizon, a cluster of white geodesic domes and concrete bunkers, it looked like a colony on a dead planet. It was beautiful, lonely, and silent. The main operations building was a concrete blockhouse, half buried in the tundra. Inside, it was a time capsule of Cold War paranoia. Banks of enormous computers with reel-to-reel tape drives lined the walls, all of them dark and dead. I set up my equipment in the center of the main command room, a space designed to listen for distant threats. The irony wasn't lost on me. For the first day, it was heaven. The only sounds were the ones I expected: the cry of the wind, the metallic groan of stressed metal, the soft hiss of my own recorder. The silence was so deep it felt physical, like a weight on my ears. That night, I huddled in my sleeping bag and put on my headphones to review the day's recordings. And that's when I heard it. Beneath the layers of wind and ambient noise was something else. A hum. It was incredibly low, a subsonic thrum, at the very edge of human hearing. Something my high-fidelity microphones were picking up with unnerving clarity. It wasn't random noise. It had a structure, a slow repeating pattern, like a coded message played at 1/10th speed. My first thought was equipment failure, a grounding issue, maybe interference from some hidden power source. I spent the entire next day troubleshooting. I checked every cable, rebooted every device, even tried setting up outside, far from the building. The hum was still there. It was on every recording. It wasn't my equipment. The sound was coming from this place. It was faint, but it was undeniably real. As the day wore on, I started to feel a strange pressure in my sinuses, a dull headache that wouldn't quit. The isolation began to press in on me, the vast empty landscape outside feeling less like a peaceful sanctuary and more like a cage. I tried to distract myself by exploring the rest of the station. I found living quarters with beds still made, a mess hall with plates on the tables. In one of the smaller, windowless communication hubs, I found something odd. The walls were lined with thick sheets of lead, not part of the original construction. It was crudely installed, as if in a panic. I had an unsettling thought. Was this to keep signals from getting in, or to keep something from getting out? The feeling of being watched, of some unseen intelligence residing here, began to take root in my mind. The hum on my recordings was getting clearer. It was still just a low-frequency drone, but it felt more complex now, the patterns shifting. It almost sounded like a voice, slowed down 1,000 times, gargling words from the bottom of an ocean. On the third night, everything changed. I was sitting in the dark, headphones on, trying to filter out the anomalous sound, when the hum suddenly surged. It wasn't just in the headphones anymore. I ripped them off my head, but the sound was still there. I could hear it with my own ears, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the concrete floor, traveling up my legs and into my chest. The fillings in my teeth began to ache. The pressure in my skull was immense, a physical pain that made me gasp. I stared in horror at my recorder's display. The waveform was no longer a simple low-frequency line. It was a jagged, complex, and terrifyingly symmetrical pattern. It looked like an EKG, the heartbeat of something colossal. The sound filled the room, a deafening, silent roar that was more felt than heard. It was intelligent. I knew it with a certainty that defied all logic. This wasn't a natural phenomenon or a residual signal. It was a broadcast, and it felt ancient, powerful, and deeply, profoundly wrong. In that moment, I understood what the men who'd worked here had discovered. This station wasn't built to listen for bombers over the pole. It was built to listen to this, and then they had tried to silence it. I didn't even pack. I grabbed my emergency backpack and ran. As I burst out of the heavy door into the freezing night, a loud, metallic shriek tore through the air. I glanced up. The massive 20-ton radar dish on the roof, frozen in place for 30 years, was moving. It was turning, slowly, ponderously, its great metal face tracking me as I scrambled away into the darkness. I don't remember much of the journey back. It was a blind, panicked flight. I never reported what happened. Who would have believed me? I left thousands of dollars of equipment in that concrete tomb, and I've never once considered going back for it. I don't create sound art anymore. I can't stand the quiet. The doctors say I have severe tinnitus, but it's more than that. In any moment of near silence in a quiet car, in my bed late at night, I can still hear it. That faint, structured hum at the very lowest register of my hearing. It's not a memory. It's an echo from that place that followed me home. Or maybe the signal finally found a receiver it could lock onto. Me. We have this arrogant notion that our ruins are empty. We see a ghost town or an abandoned factory, and we think of it as a vacuum, a hollow space where life used to be. But nature is far more pragmatic. It never allows a space to remain empty for long. When humanity recedes, something else always flows in to fill the void. I learned this firsthand in a forgotten valley, in a place the old maps called Gray Fir Settlement. I learned that when a town dies, it doesn't always become a ghost town. Sometimes it gets a new landlord. I'm a forestry surveyor, or at least I was. My job was to patrol the deep backcountry of the national park, mapping trails, monitoring forest health, and inspecting the dozens of old homesteads and settlements that lie rotting in the woods. It was mostly routine checking for structural hazards, making sure no lost hikers had taken up residence. So when I got the assignment to survey Gray Fir, I treated it like any other. It was a Depression-era logging town, abandoned almost overnight. In the late 1930s, the official story was that the timber company went bust, but there were whispers in the local histories, footnotes about a string of strange disappearances and unusual animal activity just before the exodus. I dismissed it as folklore. I was a practical man, comfortable in the wilderness, and I knew what a bear or a mountain lion could do. I wasn't afraid of old stories. I should have been. The hike into the valley took a full day. The settlement was so remote that the trail had been reclaimed by nature decades ago. As I descended into the valley proper, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It was a deep, unnatural quiet. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels, not even the buzz of insects. The entire valley seemed to be holding its breath. It was the kind of silence that signals the presence of a large predator. Gray Fir was a skeleton picked clean. A dozen or so log cabins and a larger company store sagged into the earth, their roofs collapsing under the weight of moss. As I began my survey, I started seeing the marks on the doorframes of the cabins and on the ancient fir trees surrounding the clearing. There were deep gouges in the wood. They weren't the chaotic scratches of a bear sharpening its claws. These were precise, deliberate, 3 deep, parallel lines intersected by a fourth, forming a strange, symbol-like pattern. It was on almost every structure. It felt territorial. I pushed open the door to what looked like the foreman's cabin. Inside, the destruction was absolute. A heavy iron bed frame was bent in half. A cast iron stove was torn from its chimney and thrown across the room. I've seen what a grizzly can do to a campsite. This was different. This was rage, combined with a strength that was hard to comprehend. I backed out slowly, my hand resting on the handle of the hatchet at my belt. My unease grew as dusk began to bleed through the canopy. I made the decision to camp in the relative open of the town's central clearing, building a small, contained fire. As the last of the light died, the sounds began. It started as a faint clicking from the deep woods to my left, a dry, sharp sound, like a pebble being struck against bone. A moment later, an identical sound answered from my right. Then, From the darkness directly in front of me, a new sound emerged. It was a high-pitched, chittering shriek, a horrifying mix of a bat's cry and a camera shutter. It echoed off the silent cabins, and I realized with a surge of ice-cold dread that I was in a place that had already been claimed. I wasn't a surveyor. I was a TRESPASSER. My training kicked in over the panic. I doused my fire immediately, plunging the clearing into near total darkness. The clicking grew louder, closer. It was coming from multiple directions, a coordinated hunting sound. I grabbed my pack and ran for the most defensible structure I could see, the old blacksmith's forge. It was the only building made of stone. I slammed the heavy oak door shut and dropped the thick iron bar into its brace. The forge was pitch black inside, smelling of ancient coal and rust. I didn't dare use my flashlight. I sank to the floor, my back against the cold stone, and listened. The clicking was just outside now. I could hear soft, heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel, moving with a gait that was wrong. It wasn't the two-step of a man or the four-step of an animal. It was a skittering, uneven rhythm, something immense and heavy pressed against the door, testing it, making the wood groan. Then came a deafening bang as something slammed its weight into it. Dust rained down from the mortar. A wave of primal terror washed over me. I crawled to the side wall, where a few stones had crumbled away, creating a small crack to the outside. Peering through, my heart hammered against my ribs. I couldn't see the whole creature, only parts of it illuminated by faint moonlight. A long pale limb, jointed like a spider's leg, scraped against the stone. A patch of what looked like damp, gray skin stretched taut over a skeletal frame. The thing was tall, impossibly so, and it moved with a jerky, unnatural grace. And there were more of them. I could hear them circling the forge, communicating in those awful, intelligent clicks. They weren't trying to break the door down with brute force anymore. They were scraping at the walls, testing for weakness, patient and methodical. I spent the entire night huddled in that stone box, listening to the architects of my own tomb. Just before the first hint of dawn, as suddenly as they had started, the sound stopped. The silence that rushed back in was just as terrifying. I waited, every muscle screaming, for what felt like hours. Finally, trembling, I lifted the iron bar and eased the door open. The clearing was empty. The ground was covered in deep, tracks that looked unnervingly like a bird's, but from a bird that would have stood 10 feet tall. I didn't wait to investigate further. I ran. I ran harder than I have ever run in my life, and I didn't stop until the awful silence of the valley was replaced by the beautiful, ordinary sound of bird song. My final report was a lie. I listed Grey Fir Settlement as dangerously unstable due to erosion. I recommended the entire valley be sealed off permanently. I never told anyone what I saw, but some nights, I wake up sweating, the memory of that sound, that dry, bony clicking echoing in my mind. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was the sound of a replacement. Every house settles. It's the first thing people tell you when you buy an old home. Floors creak, pipes groan, the whole frame seems to sigh at night. You're told to get used to it. But what do you do when the settling doesn't stop? When you get the distinct, creeping feeling that your new home isn't done settling, but is still being built. Not repaired, not renovated, built, and you are living inside the construction site. That's a feeling no one prepares you for. My partner, Chloe, and I bought the house on Ash Street in the fall. It was our dream home, a century-old craftsman that had been recently flipped. The renovator had done a masterful job, preserving the old-world charm while installing a modern kitchen and sleek, new bathrooms. It felt solid, pristine, and most importantly, it felt finished. We spent the first 2 weeks in a state of bliss, arranging furniture, planning our garden, and marveling at our good fortune. I worked from home as a graphic designer, so while Chloe was at her office, I spent long, quiet hours alone in our new space. It was during those hours that I first began to notice the house's eccentricities. A floorboard that would creak one day, but not the next. A door that would stick in its frame for a week, and then swing freely, as if it had never been a problem. I chalked it all up to the house breathing, expanding and contracting with the autumn humidity. It was charming, at first that the charm began to fade about a month in. I was in my office, a small spare bedroom upstairs, when I got up to stretch my legs. I walked down the hall toward the bathroom, and my shoulder brushed against the door frame. It struck me as odd. I'd walked that path 100 times and never touched the frame. I paused, looking back. The hallway seemed narrower. I shook my head, blaming eye strain from staring at a screen all day, but the feeling lingered. The next day, I went to turn on the living room light, and my hand went to the empty wall beside the doorway. I stood there for a moment, confused, before finding the switch on the other side of the frame. I could have sworn it had been on the left. Chloe just laughed when I mentioned it. "You're just tired, love," she'd said. "You've got new house brain." But I knew where that light switch had been. My paranoia began to take on a quiet, methodical shape. I started taking pictures with my phone, documenting the angles of rooms, the placement of outlets, the widths of hallways. I bought a laser tape measure. On a Tuesday, I measured the main hallway, 4 feet, 2 inches wide. On Thursday, I measured it again, 3 feet, 11 inches. My blood ran cold. I showed Chloe the conflicting photos, the measurements in my notebook. She looked at me with deep concern. "Babe," she said softly, "maybe you need to take a break. Get out of the house for a bit." She thought I was losing my mind, and her doubt was more terrifying than any shrinking wall. I felt utterly alone, a prisoner in my own home which seemed to be closing in on me. I started hearing sounds inside the walls, not the scratching of mice, but a faint, rhythmic tapping. Sometimes, a soft scraping sound, like wood being planed, and once, clear as day, I heard the sharp thwip of a tape measure snapping shut. It was in that moment I realized this wasn't a haunting. The house wasn't occupied by something dead. It was occupied by a worker. The breaking point came on a Wednesday night. I had been documenting a small hairline crack that had appeared in the plaster of my office wall. Over 3 days, it had widened, splintered, and traveled from the ceiling to the floor. I was becoming convinced the wall was slowly bulging inward. That night, I was jolted awake by a tremendous crash from downstairs. Chloe and I both rushed out of bed and down the stairs. In the living room, a large, heavy bookcase had toppled over, scattering books across the floor, but it hadn't just fallen. The wall behind it was warped, buckled into a sickening curve. It looked like it had been pushed out from the inside with incredible, silent force. As we stared at it, a fine, pale dust began to trickle from a fresh crack near the baseboard. Chloe thought a pipe had burst, but I knew better. The sounds, the measurements, the shifting architecture, it all culminated in this moment. An unhinged obsession took hold of me. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox. Chloe yelled at me to stop, but I didn't listen. I swung the hammer into the buckled drywall. It shattered icily, but behind it, there was no insulation, no wiring, no wooden studs. There was only a dark, hollow space that seemed to absorb the light from the room. It was an impossible void, a cavity that shouldn't exist within the frame of our home, and from the depths of that darkness, I heard it again. The sharp, distinct sound of a tape measure snapping shut, as if a final measurement had just been taken. Then a voice, a dry whisper that sounded like dust and old paper, spoke a single, horrifying word. Done. We were out of the house in 5 minutes. We stayed in a hotel and never went back. Our beautiful, perfect home was repossessed by the bank. Chloe eventually came to believe me, or at least, she chose to believe me over the alternative that I had gone completely insane. My family thinks I had a breakdown, but I know what happened. I checked the real estate listings for it sometimes. It was sold again a year later. The new photos are bright and cheerful, but I can see it. The living room is definitely smaller now. The window above the kitchen sink is gone, and the front door is in a completely different place. Someone, or something, is still working on the house on Ash Street, and I think, sooner or later, they'll finish it for good. When you buy a house, you're told you're buying the property, the land, the structure, the fixtures. What they don't tell you is that you're also inheriting the echoes. Most are faint as scuff on the floor where a chair used to be, a faded rectangle on the wall where a picture hung for 50 years. They're harmless. But the old man who owned our house before us, he didn't just leave an echo. He left behind a piece of his weekly routine. And that routine had no intention of stopping just because his heart had taught my wife, Sarah, and I bought our first home on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was a modest bungalow, a little dated, but solid and well cared for. The realtor told us the previous owner, a Mr. Abernathy, had lived there for over 60 years before passing away peacefully in a nursing home. The whole house had a distinct scent when we first viewed it, a gentle, not unpleasant mix of old books, pipe tobacco, and a faint powdery floral smell. We spent the first month scrubbing, painting, and airing the place out, eager to replace his story with our own, but one scent stubbornly refused to leave. In the small spare bedroom upstairs, a faint but persistent aroma of lavender lingered in the air. While cleaning out the attic, we found a dusty cardboard box filled with carousels of old 35mm slides. The box was simply labeled, "Our Memories." We set it aside, intending to throw it out, and thought nothing more of it. We were young, and the past felt like a foreign country. Our new life was peaceful, predictable, until the first Tuesday. I was working late in my study downstairs when I heard it. A faint, mechanical sound from the spare bedroom directly above me. It was a rhythmic, unmistakable sound from my own childhood, the soft whir of a fan, followed by the gentle click-clack of a slide projector advancing to the next image. I froze, listening. Whir, click-clack, whir, click-clack. I crept up the stairs, my heart beginning to thump. The door to the spare room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The room was dark, empty, and silent. The sound was gone. And yet, the smell of lavender was stronger than I had ever known it to be. Sarah was out with friends, and when I told her later, she brushed it off. It was probably the neighbor's TV. Honey, this old house has thin walls. I tried to believe her, but the next Tuesday, it happened again. The same time, the same room, the same sound. This time, Sarah was home. She heard it too. A quiet, ghostly rhythm from the empty room upstairs. We searched the entire house, the attic, the basement. There was no slide projector. The following weekend, an older neighbor from across the street came over to introduce herself. She'd known Mr. Abernathy for years. "Such a sweet man," she said. "He missed his Eleanor terribly." She told us his wife Eleanor had died in that house, in that spare bedroom, many years ago. She had loved lavender, and every Tuesday night, right up until the day they moved him to the home, Mr. Abernathy would go into her old room, open a bottle of her perfume to let the scent fill the air, and spend the evening looking through old slides of their life together. It was his ritual, his way of spending one more evening with her. The news hit me like a physical blow. We weren't hearing a ghost. We were hearing the echo of a profound love, a habit etched so deeply into the fabric of the house that it couldn't be erased. A creeping sense of being an intruder began to settle over me. This wasn't our house. It was their sanctuary. We were just squatting in it. The sound became a source of dread. Every Tuesday, as evening approached, a quiet tension would fill the house. We'd try to ignore it, turn up the TV, but it was always there, at the edge of hearing whir, click-clack, a sad, spectral punctuation mark to our week. One rainy Tuesday, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to a pawn shop and bought a clunky, old, slide projector. That evening, I retrieved the dusty box labeled Our Memories from the attic. Sarah thought I was crazy, but she didn't try to stop me. I set the projector up on a small table in the spare bedroom, aimed it at the blank wall, and loaded the first carousel. As the sun went down, the air in the room grew cold. The scent of lavender, once faint, became thick and almost overwhelming, as if a bottle had just been opened. With a trembling hand, I turned on the projector. The fan whirred to life, and the first image clicked into place. It was a faded photo of a smiling young woman with kind eyes, holding a bouquet of lavender. Eleanor. I clicked through the slides, one by one. Their wedding. A vacation to the Grand Canyon. A child's birthday party. A life lived fully, now reduced to silent squares of light on a wall. As I watched their memories play out, the feeling of being watched myself grew stronger with each click. I reached the end of the carousel. I pressed the button one last time. The machine clicked, but the slot was empty. The projector shone a perfect, bright white rectangle on the wall. The room was silent, except for the whirring of the fan, and then I heard it. A soft, contented sigh, right beside me. My eyes were locked on that empty square of light, and in it, two new shadows appeared. They were cast from the projector's beam, but their source wasn't in the room. They were perfect, crisp silhouettes, one of a tall, stooped man, the other of a woman resting, her head on his shoulder. They stood together, looking at the white screen, as if they were finally watching the one memory that was missing. We left the projector running when we fled the room. We sold the house a few weeks later, taking a loss just to be free of it. We never told the new owners why we were leaving. What could we say? That the house was already occupied, not by ghosts, but by a love story that refused to end. I hope the new family learns to live with it. I hope they learn to respect the quiet sanctity of a Tuesday night. And I hope, for their own sake, they don't throw away that old box of slides. Some things don't belong to the living. Every kid digs for treasure in a new backyard. It's a rite of passage, a search for pirate gold or old glass bottles. My son, Leo, was no different. When we moved into our new house, the first thing he did was grab a trowel and start exploring. The problem is, he didn't find a pirate's chest. He found something else, something that had been buried, but not nearly deep enough. And he made the simple, childish mistake of bringing it inside. It was supposed to be a fresh start for us. After a rough couple of years, I'd saved up enough to buy a small house on the edge of town. It was older, and the backyard was a wild, overgrown space that blended into a thick patch of woods. For my 8-year-old son Leo, it was paradise. He spent hours out there, mapping his new kingdom, and I was just happy to see him smile. The house itself needed work, but it was ours. It felt safe. It felt like a fortress. How wrong I was. One afternoon, Leo ran inside, his face flushed with excitement, clutching a small, dirt-caked wooden box. It was old, bound with brittle leather. Straps. Treasure. Mom, he yelled. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried moss, was a strange figurine. It was carved from a single piece of dark, gnarled root. Vaguely humanoid, but with limbs that were too long and a body that was twisted and thin. It had no face, just a smooth, blank surface where the eyes and mouth should have been. It gave me a shiver, but Leo was enchanted. He called it the Root Man and insisted on keeping it on his bedside table. The first week was fine, then the strange things started. I'd hear faint scratching sounds from Leo's room late at night. When I'd check on him, he'd be fast asleep, the Root Man sitting silently on his nightstand. Then Leo began talking about it. The Root Man tells me secrets, he'd say at breakfast, his eyes wide. He knows everything about the woods. I chalked it up to an imaginary friend, a way to cope with the move, but his secrets were unsettlingly specific. He told me which tree in the yard was sick on the inside, which patch of soil was too sour to grow anything. He was always right. Then I started finding things. Little piles of rich, black soil in the middle of the hallway. A single, desiccated beetle on my pillow. A damp, curled leaf on the pristine kitchen counter. Leo would swear he didn't do it, and I believed him. Around the same time, my houseplants began to die. One by one, they withered, their leaves turning black no matter how much I watered them. All except for one. A single, stubborn weed had sprouted from a crack in the floorboards inside Leo's closet, and it was growing with an unnatural vigor. The house no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like it had been breached. The end came on a moonless night. I was woken from a deep sleep by a strange noise. It was a low, rhythmic thumping sound, steady and deep. It was coming from Leo's room. It sounded, impossibly, like a heartbeat. My own heart hammering in my chest. I crept out of bed and pushed his door open a crack. The room was cold. The window was wide open, a silent invitation to the dark woods outside. Leo was standing beside it, his back to me, perfectly still. I looked at his nightstand. The Root Man was there, but it looked wrong. It seemed larger, its twisted limbs unfurled as if stretching after a long sleep. The deep thumping was coming from it. As I watched in horror, a pale, thread-like tendril snaked out from the base of the figurine. It crawled across the wooden table, dropped to the floor, and slithered across the room until it disappeared into the crack in the closet where the weed was growing. Leo turned his head slowly. His eyes were glassy and unfocused in the dim light. "He's hungry," he whispered, his voice flat and empty. "He wants to come all the way inside now." Just then, a loud, scraping sound echoed from right outside the window. A long, dark shape, like a gnarled branch, tapped sharply against the glass, demanding entry. I don't remember screaming. I just remember the feeling of cold, absolute terror. I lunged into the room, grabbed Leo with one arm and the thrumming, vibrating figurine with the other. I ran. We clattered down the stairs, and I didn't stop until I was in front of the fireplace. With a strangled sob, I threw the Root Man into the empty hearth. I fumbled with a lighter and set a piece of newspaper ablaze, tossing it in after it. The root wood didn't catch fire at first. It just smoked, and a high-pitched, wailing sound, like air being forced through shrieking lungs, filled the house. Then it finally caught, burning with a sick, green light. The thumping stopped. We left the next day. I abandoned the house, the mortgage, everything. We live in a concrete high-rise in the city now, 20 floors up. There are no yards, no woods, no soil. It's the only way I feel safe. But sometimes, when I'm walking down the street, I'll see a stubborn little weed forcing its way through a crack in the pavement, and I'll feel a cold dread wash over me. And if I stand there too long, I swear, I can feel a faint, rhythmic vibration coming from deep beneath my feet. A slow, patient, and familiar heartbeat. It was the kind of humid, August night in rural Tennessee, where the air itself feels thick with something ancient and unnameable. I was a graduate student in anthropology, working on a project about early American folk burial traditions. That's how I ended up in the old Riverbend Cemetery, a place forgotten even by the locals. They called it Whispering Pines because of the way the wind moved through the tall loblolly pines that encircled the plot. But that night, the air was dead still. My equipment, a tripod, a digital camera with a thermal lens, and a high-sensitivity microphone was set up near the oldest section, where the headstones were just moss-covered lumps of rock, some dating back to the late 1700s. I wasn't looking for ghosts, just for data. But data and history are rarely as clean as you want them to be. I remember checking my watch. It was just past midnight. The moon was a sliver, and the only light came from my headlamp, cutting a narrow beam through the oppressive darkness. My research wasn't supposed to be a ghost hunt, but it was starting to feel like one. The first few hours were uneventful, just the hum of my equipment and the occasional rustle of some unseen night creature in the underbrush. I was cataloging the faint carvings on a slate marker when my camera's thermal display flickered. A hotspot appeared near the base of a crumbling, ornate headstone, shaped like a weeping angel, with its face worn away by centuries of rain. The temperature spike was impossible. There was no source of heat, no animal, no person, nothing. I dismissed it as a glitch, a common issue with older equipment. I marked the spot on my tablet and moved on. The feeling of being watched started then. It was subtle at first, just a prickle on the back of my neck. I'd swing my headlamp around, and for a fraction of a second, the light would catch on something dark at the edge of my vision, a shape that dissolved the moment I focused. The air grew colder, despite the thick humidity. Not just a drop, but a distinct, unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. I pulled my jacket tighter, trying to rationalize it away as a draft. There were no drafts. As the night wore on, the strange occurrences began to escalate. The hotspots on my thermal camera became more frequent, appearing not just as singular points, but as faint, indistinct outlines that would shimmer and fade. They weren't in any particular place. They would appear near one grave, then another, moving through the rows of markers like silent, ethereal phantoms. I started to hear things with my own ears, sounds that my equipment couldn't pick up. Faint whispers, like dry leaves skittering across the grass, but there was no wind. I told myself it was just the forest, the creaks of old trees, the sounds of my own mind playing tricks on me in the isolated dark. Then the dirt shifted. I was kneeling to take a macro photograph of a faded epitaph when the ground next to me seemed to exhale a low, groaning sound. A small mound of earth, right next to an unmarked depression, rose about an inch and then settled back down. It was slow and deliberate, as if something was pushing from beneath. My heart hammered in my chest. I got to my feet, my headlamp beam shaking. I tried to convince myself it was just burrowing animals, but the movement was too synchronized, too human. I heard another sound then, a scratching, not from the earth, but from the surface of a nearby headstone. I crept closer, and my headlamp beam revealed a fresh scratch mark on the granite, thin and white, as if made by a human fingernail. I shone the light on another stone, and another, and another. Each one had a new, stark white scratch on its surface. It was as if they were all trying to claw their way out. The whispers grew louder, no longer just a faint rustling, but a chorus of indistinct moans and pleas, all seeming to come from the ground beneath my feet. The climax came when I tried to pack up and leave. My field notes were scattered, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my equipment. As I reached for my tripod, I heard a sound from the row of graves directly behind me. It was a wet, heavy sound, like someone dragging a sack of potatoes through mud. I whipped my headlamp around, and my breath hitched in my throat. Standing over a freshly dug, empty grave was the shape from my thermal camera. It was a translucent, shimmering figure, vaguely human, made of heat and distortion, its form wavering in the humid air. It wasn't menacing. Not in a traditional sense. It was just there, its heat signature radiating an unnatural coldness. It reached a hand along, indistinct limb down, into the empty pit, and as it did, the groaning from the ground swelled into a single, agonizing scream. Not a human scream, but something deep and guttural and full of despair, as if the earth itself was crying out. The figure didn't turn to look at me, but I felt its attention. It was looking for something. As it pulled its hand back from the grave, a small, dark shape, like a lump of wet clay, was clutched in its shimmering palm. The figure brought the shape to what I assumed was its face, and the whispering, the moaning, and the scratching all ceased in a single, deafening moment of silence. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. The figure's thermal outline intensified for a moment. Then it released the shape back into the grave and turned its shimmering, faceless form toward me. It began to drift forward, a wave of palpable, icy coldness preceding it. I didn't wait to see what it wanted. I scrambled for my bag, leaving my tripod and camera behind, and ran. I ran blindly through the rows of headstones, tripping over roots and graves, not stopping until I burst through the wrought iron gate and onto the dark gravel road. I drove away without looking back. I never went back for my equipment. The memory of that faceless figure and the sounds from the earth itself still haunt me. I've tried to find a rational explanation, but there isn't one. What was that thing looking for? What did it find? The only thing I know for sure is that some graves aren't just for the dead. They're also for the things the dead left behind. Growing up in a small town in Massachusetts, the local graveyard wasn't a place of fear for us. It was a part of life. The old hill burying ground was a historical landmark, a peaceful place with centuries of history etched into its weathered slate headstones. As teenagers, my friends and I would cut through it to get to the convenience store on the other side of town. It was a shortcut, nothing more. We'd sometimes dare each other to touch the oldest stones, the ones from the 1600s, but it was all just bravado. We'd tell ghost stories, of course, but the graveyard itself felt too quiet, too sleepy, to be truly scary. It was a comfortable part of our landscape, a backdrop to our youthful indiscretions. It was only when I was 21, home for the summer after my third year of college, that the graveyard's sleepy veneer began to crack. My job was helping the town's elderly caretaker, Mr. Abernathy, with some landscaping and groundskeeping. My duties were simple: trim hedges, pull weeds, and straighten up the fallen markers. It was a monotonous but peaceful job, and I spent most of my time alone, listening to music and enjoying the solitude. The first strange thing was a recurring sound, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching. It was like a rat scurrying through the underbrush, or a tree branch scraping against a stone. It started on my third day on the job, and I'd hear it just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. I'd turn off my music, and the sound would stop. I'd dismiss it as my imagination, or the sounds of the woods that bordered the cemetery. The second thing was a recurring pattern of displaced objects. I'd be raking leaves near a row of graves, and would find a child's toy, a single faded marble, or a smooth river stone placed carefully on top of a headstone. The strangest one was a small, polished brass key, placed right on the corner of a grave belonging to a woman who had died in 1888. It was the same row where I'd heard the scratching. I picked up the key, confused, but then, feeling a strange chill, I put it back exactly where I found it. The next day, it was gone. The scratching became more distinct. It wasn't the sound of an animal anymore. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound, like someone tracing lines into stone with a sharp tool. I'd stop what I was doing and try to pinpoint the source, but it would always stop before I could find it. I brought it up to Mr. Abernathy, who just shrugged and said, "It's an old place. Old places make noise. The real dread began to set in a week later. I was working late, trying to finish clearing a section of brush near the back wall of the cemetery, where the oldest and most forgotten graves lay. The sun had set, and the light was fading fast. The air was still and humid, a classic Massachusetts summer evening. That's when I saw the figure. Not a ghost, not a shimmering specter, but a real, solid person, or so I thought. They were standing at the edge of the woods, a man in a dark, old-fashioned suit, his back to me, facing the oldest graves. He was perfectly still, staring at the ground. I felt a surge of unease. Visitors after hours were forbidden. I called out, "Hey, sir, the cemetery's closed." He didn't move. He didn't even turn his head. I felt a prickle of fear. There was something wrong about his stillness, the way he seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I took a step closer, my voice more hesitant now. "Sir, you need to leave." That's when I heard the scratching again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from the ground, from the very spot where the man was standing. It was a frantic, continuous sound, like a shovel being scraped against a rock, but muffled by earth. The figure still didn't move, but I watched as his shoulders began to heave in a silent, frantic rhythm. It looked like he was weeping, but there was no sound. Then, as I watched in horror, the earth at his feet began to shift, not slowly, like it had before, but in a frantic, panicked motion. Little clods of dirt and small stones were being pushed up from below. The scratching grew into a frantic, high-pitched scuttling, as if something was trapped and fighting its way out. The man in the suit began to tremble, his entire body convulsing with the silent, desperate effort. The climax arrived in a single, horrifying moment. The man in the suit suddenly and violently fell to his knees, his hands dropping to the disturbed patch of earth. His fingers dug into the soil, as if he were trying to hold something down, to push it back. The earth beneath his hands bulged and then split open, and a single, skeletal hand, its bones the color of old ivory, shot out of the ground. It was an impossibly fast, impossibly thin hand, and it latched onto the man's wrist. The man in the suit cried out, but the sound was choked and thin, like a whisper. He struggled, pulling his arm back, but the skeletal hand was impossibly strong. As he fought, more of the unseen creature beneath the soil began to emerge. First, a section of arm, its skin a stretched, translucent gray, and then the top of a smooth, bald head, like a grotesque, pale skull. The man in the suit was no longer trying to push it back. He was screaming, a silent, terror-filled shriek as the thing began to pull him down into the grave. He was being dragged, foot by foot, into the disturbed earth. I saw his face then, for the first time. It was a gaunt, hollow face, filled with an ancient, unbearable sorrow. And as the skeletal hand pulled him closer, I saw that it was his own hand. He wasn't a man in a suit. He was the reanimated corpse of a man, and he was being reclaimed by whatever he had tried to leave behind. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, and he opened his mouth, not to scream, but to say a single word, "Help." I stood frozen for a few seconds, the sight of his face in that single, desperate word burning into my memory. Then, I turned and ran, not through the graveyard, but back out into the street. I didn't stop until I was home, safe inside my house. I never went back to that job. Mr. Abernathy called me a few times, asking where I'd gone, but I never answered. I couldn't tell him what I saw. I still live in this town, but I haven't set foot in the old hill burying ground since that night. I still sometimes walk past its fence, and I can hear it, that faint, rhythmic scratching sound, like someone patiently trying to claw their way out. I've often wondered what was buried with that man, what was so terrible that he had to try and escape his own grave, but I'm too afraid to ever find out. I've always been drawn to old things, to places where the past feels heavy and tangible. That's what took me to the Boot Hill Cemetery in Tombstone, Arizona. Not the famous one, but a smaller, less-known graveyard on the outskirts of town, where the sun beats down on crumbling sandstone markers and forgotten wooden crosses. I'm a photographer, and my work focuses on documenting these neglected corners of history before they're lost to time and weather. The cemetery was vast, isolated, and silent, except for the wind and the relentless heat. I had permission from the local historical society to be there, and I'd spend my days meticulously cataloging each grave, each faded name and date, my camera clicking quietly in the suffocating heat. The ground was so dry and hard, the graves themselves looked like they had been forgotten for centuries. I felt a sense of reverence for the place, an obligation to the stories buried beneath my feet. The first hint of something being wrong was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a malicious feeling, more of a quiet, curious presence. I'd turn to look, and there would be nothing but the stark landscape of scrub brush and bleached bone-dry earth. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, a dry hiss as it passed through the sparse weeds. But as the sun went down and the air grew still, the whispers continued. They were indistinct, like a radio tuned between stations, a low, constant murmur of voices just beyond my ability to comprehend. I'd shut off my camera and stand perfectly still, straining to hear, but the moment I focused, they would fade. The third day, I found a stone on a grave that hadn't been there before. It was a smooth, dark piece of obsidian, glinting in the sun, placed on a grave marked with a simple, illegible wooden cross. The grave was old, probably from the 1880s. I took a photo, made a note of it, and moved on. The next day, the stone was on a different grave, this one belonging to a family, a mother and her 2 children, who had died of fever in the late 1870s. It was unnerving. I was the only person with access to this section of the cemetery, and the gates were locked at night. Someone or something was moving that stone. The whispers seemed to grow louder as I worked, a constant, buzzing static just at the edge of my hearing, and I could have sworn I began to hear my name, said in a voice as dry and brittle as the desert floor. I began to work faster. The quiet reverence I'd felt replaced with a growing sense of dread. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the unseen presence. The whispering was now a clear chorus of voices, not in English, but in some language I couldn't place. It sounded like an old, ancient tongue, filled with long, sibilant syllables. I was photographing a row of graves belonging to miners who had died in a cave-in when I saw a shimmering in the air. Not a figure, not a person, but a heat haze that didn't belong. It was right above a grave, a small, unmarked plot with just a single, sharp stone at its head. The air above it rippled, and I swear I could see a faint, ghostly outline of a pickaxe and shovel, as if they were being used by an invisible hand to work the dry soil. The whispering swelled, and it was a cacophony of voices now, all seeming to emanate from the ground itself. The dry earth began to shift, not like something was pushing from beneath, but as if something was being stirred. Fine particles of dust and sand began to rise from the grave, forming a small, swirling vortex in the air above the stone. It was like a miniature dust devil, but it was perfectly contained over that one grave, rotating slowly. It was silent, but the sight of it, this unnatural spiral of dust, filled me with an indescribable terror. The whispering stopped abruptly, a complete and utter silence. The stillness was more chilling than the noise had been. The climax arrived in the form of the whispers returning, but this time they were not indistinct. They were clear, and they were speaking a single, repeated word in the ancient tongue. As the dust vortex swirled faster and faster, I could feel an immense coldness radiating from the ground, the opposite of what you'd expect in the hot desert. The whispers grew in volume, becoming a desperate, frantic chant. The vortex of dust intensified, and from its center, something began to form. Not a body, not a person, but an object. It was a small, ornate silver locket, tarnished and caked in centuries of dust, but distinct. It rose slowly from the swirling dust and hovered in the air above the grave. The whispering stopped, and the air filled with the sounds of weeping. Not human tears, but a dry, rattling sob that seemed to come from the locket itself. As I watched in horrified fascination, the locket opened, and I could just make out a faint, faded photograph inside. A woman's face. The whispers returned, and now they were in English, and they were the most terrifying sound I have ever heard. They were coming from the grave itself, a multitude of voices, all screaming a single, unified plea: give it back, give it back, give it back. The locket, its weeping sound now, a high-pitched wail, began to descend, pulled down by some unseen force. The earth around the grave began to crack and heave, and I could hear the faint, hollow sound of 1,000 stones shifting, as if the entire cemetery was stirring to reclaim what had been taken from it. I didn't stay to find out what would happen. I dropped my camera, my tripod, everything, and ran. The sound of the screams and the wordless pleas of "give it back" followed me all the way to my car. I drove away and never returned. I still have the photographs from that day, but I can't bring myself to look at them. Every time I close my eyes, I can see that swirling vortex of dust and the silver locket hovering in the air. I never understood what was so important about that locket. What was taken from that grave that it would cause the dead to scream for its return? But I know one thing. In some places, the dead aren't just buried. They're guarding something. The most wonderful time of the year. That's what they call it. I grew up in a small town in rural Vermont, a place where winter was a real, tangible presence, and Christmas wasn't just a holiday. It was a season of hunkering down and holding on. My grandfather had a cabin deep in the woods, a place without cell service, without a TV, just a wood stove and the deafening silence of a snow-covered landscape. We'd go every Christmas Eve, a family tradition that was supposed to be a cozy escape. The first time I felt it, I was 12. We were sitting around the fire, my parents, my older brother, and me, and I felt a sudden, deep chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. It was a cold that seemed to come from inside the cabin, from the very walls themselves. My brother gave me a weird look, and I knew he felt it too. I remember my mom just shivered and said, "Must be a draft." But there was no draft, and the faint sound I heard, just a single, sharp jingle, like a bell, was something I kept to myself. The strange occurrences began to escalate the following year. I was a little older, a little more aware. We were at the cabin, and it was snowing hard, a blizzard that had trapped us for the night. The power was out, so we were using oil lamps, and the fire was roaring. My mom was humming a Christmas tune as she read a book, and that's when I saw it. The gingerbread men hanging from the tree. They weren't a fresh batch. They were ones we had made the year before and had hung up again for tradition. There were 8 of them, all in a row. As I watched, one of them, the one on the far end, slowly began to turn on its thread. It turned and turned and turned, facing away from the fire, and then it stopped. A few minutes later, another one started to turn. It wasn't the heat from the fire, I checked, and it wasn't a draft. I just sat there, watching as each gingerbread man, one by one, slowly rotated away from the warmth and the light, until they were all facing the wall. I told my brother, but he just laughed and said I was being paranoid. The next morning, they were all facing the right way again. It started to feel like the cabin was alive, and it didn't want us there. I'd be trying to sleep, listening to the wind and the fire, and I'd hear a sound like a small, hollow tapping, coming from the walls, from the floorboards, from the ceiling. It was too regular to be an animal. Tap, tap, tap. And sometimes, it would be followed by a soft, dry whisper, like a secret being told in a language made of dust. My parents never heard it. Or at least, they never said they did. The third Christmas we went back to the cabin. The sense of dread was almost unbearable. I was now 15, and my brother and I had a silent understanding. We'd go to bed, and the tapping would begin, and we'd lie in the dark, our eyes wide open, just waiting for the next sound. This time, it wasn't just the gingerbread men. We had a string of lights, a battery-powered one, and it would flicker in the most unnatural way, not like a bad connection, but in a slow, pulsing rhythm. On, off, and as it pulsed, the faint, distorted sound of the carol I had heard years before would play, just for a second, then vanish. I remember one night, I had to use the outhouse. It was freezing, the snow was past my knees, and the wind was howling. The outhouse was a small, ramshackle building about 20 yards from the cabin, and I had a headlamp to light my way. As I was heading back, my headlamp beam caught something by the tree line. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. It was dark, a shadow against the white snow. I froze, my breath a cloud in the air. As I watched, the figure slowly lifted its arm, and I saw something glinting in the faint light, a single silver bell, like the kind you hang on a door. The figure shook its arm, and the bell rang. Not a friendly jingle, but a single, sharp, piercing sound that cut through the silence of the woods. It rang, and the figure took a single, unnatural step forward. Its movements were all wrong, too slow, too jerky, like a marionette with a broken string. I turned and ran, not back to the outhouse, but straight into the cabin, slamming the door and sliding the bolt home. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. The climax came the next day, Christmas Eve. The snow had stopped, and a strange, almost silent stillness had fallen over the woods. My brother and I were alone in the main room, my parents in their bedroom. The fire was low. We heard the sound then, a single, sharp scraping noise coming from the window. We both looked. The figure I had seen the night before was there, not in a menacing way, but it was at the window, its face pressed against the glass. It was not a person. It was an entity, a thing made of dried branches and woven straw, its head a crude, hollow gourd. It had two glowing orange points where its eyes should have been, and in one of its twig-like hands, it held a bundle of something. I looked at the window, and I saw a new detail. The glass was so old and thin, it was almost like a mirror, and I could see my own terrified face reflected back at me, but superimposed over the reflection was the faintest image of a child's face, weeping, its mouth open in a silent scream. The thing at the window pressed its face closer, and a faint whisper came through the glass, a dry, rustling sound that said, "Let me in." It slowly lifted its other hand, the one holding the bundle, and I saw what it was. It was a small, perfectly preserved gingerbread man, identical to the ones on our tree, only this one had a single, black ribbon tied around its waist. The creature placed the gingerbread man on the windowsill, and then it pointed a single, impossibly long finger at my brother and me, and its glowing eyes seemed to bore into us. The silence was broken only by a single, sharp, almost human cry that seemed to come from the gingerbread man on the sill. My brother and I screamed and scrambled backwards, stumbling over furniture and knocking over the poker. My parents burst into the room and turned on their lanterns. The creature at the window was gone. The gingerbread man was gone. My parents saw our terror and assumed it was a prank, a story, a figment of our imaginations. But my brother and I knew the truth. We refused to go back to the cabin. I still have no idea what that thing was, what it wanted, or what was in that bundle. But I've since learned that in certain parts of New England, there are old folk tales about a creature that visits homes during the deepest part of winter, a wicker man or branch witch who comes for children who have been promised to it. I'll never know if that's what it was, or what it was a manifestation of. All I know is that every Christmas now, I leave a gingerbread man on my windowsill. A single, solitary figure, facing out into the dark. I do it because I'm afraid of what might come if I don't. And I still hear, sometimes on a silent night, that single, lonely jingle of a bell. Halloween in my hometown in rural Ohio was always a big deal. Not because of big parties or elaborate haunted houses, but because of the local legend of the whispering scarecrows. They were a permanent fixture in the fields surrounding our small town. Old, crudely made figures that local farmers would put up every year. They weren't scary, just a part of the landscape. As a kid, my friends and I would ride our bikes past them, daring each other to touch them, laughing at their ragged clothes and button eyes. They were just objects. But my grandfather, a man who had lived his entire life in that area, always had a deep respect for them. "Don't mess with the scarecrows," he'd tell me. "They're not for scaring birds. They're for scaring something else." I never asked him what he meant, because I didn't think there was anything to mean. The stories were just that, stories. It was all part of the Halloween fun, and the scarecrows were nothing more than a creepy backdrop to the autumn chill. The weirdness started when I was in high school. The first sign was when I started to notice how many of them there were. One year, there were a few dozen in the fields. The next, it seemed like there were twice as many. And they were different. Some were still the simple, cross-shaped figures, but others were more elaborate, almost human-shaped. One had a crude wooden face carved from a log, with 2 holes for eyes that seemed to follow you. Another had a tattered dress and a bundle of straw for a head. They were more unsettling now, less like props and more like sentinels. The whispers came next, not from the scarecrows themselves, but from the air around them. On a crisp October night, when the wind was still, I'd be walking home and pass by a field, and I'd hear it, a low, sibilant sound, like someone breathing through clenched teeth. It would rise and fall, a quiet, almost musical hiss, and it always seemed to be saying my name, or a fragmented version of it. I'd stop, and the sound would stop. I'd take a step, and it would start again. It was a phantom sound, something that my brain heard but my ears couldn't place. I mentioned it to my friend, who just told me I was hearing things. But I wasn't. I knew I wasn't. The whispers weren't malicious. They were more like a greeting, a form of acknowledgement. The scarecrows had seen me. The true dread began when the scarecrows began to move. I know how that sounds, and I don't mean they walked. They would be in one spot, and the next day, they would be in another. I was driving home from a late-night football game, and I saw a scarecrow that I knew was near the road. But now it was standing in the middle of an open field, its arms outstretched in a welcoming gesture. It was impossible. There was no way anyone could have moved it so fast and so far. The feeling of being watched became a constant state of being. No matter where I was, I felt the dozens of unseen eyes on me. I'd be looking out my bedroom window at night, and I'd see a new scarecrow in the field across the street, a tall, gaunt figure that hadn't been there before. It was just standing there, its dark form a stark contrast to the pale moonlight. The sound of the wind was gone, replaced by the sound of the whispers, and they weren't saying my name anymore. They were saying something else. Something about the offering and the harvest. My grandfather had told me once that the farmers had a pact, an old tradition, to put up the scarecrows to protect the fields. But now, I was starting to understand that they weren't protecting the fields from something. They were protecting something for the fields. The climax arrived on Halloween night. I was a senior in high school, and I had stayed home, too unnerved to go out with my friends. The house was empty, and the air was thick with a strange stillness. I was in my room when I heard the tapping. Not a loud, aggressive sound, but a soft, rhythmic tapping, like dry wood on glass. I went downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and looked out the front window. A scarecrow was standing on my front lawn. Not just any scarecrow. It was the one from the field across the street, the tall, gaunt figure. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was a real scarecrow, its burlap sack head and straw hands rustling in the wind that I couldn't feel. It was tapping at the window with a long, thin twig. Its head was cocked to the side, as if it were listening for a response. As I watched in silent horror, I saw a small, dark bundle hanging from its other hand. It was about the size of a doll, and it was wrapped in a small piece of burlap. The creature at the window slowly lifted the bundle, and I could feel a new, powerful feeling in the air. A feeling of an old, deep hunger. The whispering in the air was now a clear, distinct chorus, and it was chanting a single word, welcome. The scarecrow held the bundle up, and I saw a small, pale hand with a single, slender finger sticking out from a tear in the burlap. It was the hand of a child, and it was pointing directly at me. The whispering grew louder, and the sound of the wind, which I now realized was coming from the scarecrow itself, began to sound like a low, hollow laugh. I stumbled backwards, falling over a chair, my hands clamped over my ears, trying to block out the sound of the whispers and the tapping. When I finally found the courage to look again, the scarecrow was gone, but something was left behind on the doorstep. A small bundle of burlap, identical to the one the scarecrow had been holding. I never opened it. I couldn't. My parents came home later, and I told them I had heard something. They dismissed it as my imagination, a Halloween trick, but I knew better. I packed my bags that night and left. I never went back to that town. I still don't know what the scarecrows are, what they are protecting, and what that offering was meant to be. But every year on Halloween, I turn off all the lights and lock all the doors and wait. I wait to hear the whispers, and I wait for the sound of the tapping, because I know that somewhere, in a field far away, a new scarecrow has been put up, and it is looking for me. The roads out here in the deserts of Nevada are a strange kind of empty. It's a vacuum of silence where your own thoughts feel loud and the darkness feels like a physical presence. I was on a long, solitary drive, heading east, toward Utah, my rig, the only moving thing for miles. It was late, past midnight, and I was deep into that exhausted, meditative state that long-haul drivers know. My mind was numb, but my eyes were sharp, scanning the long black ribbon of asphalt for any sign of a car or animal. That's when I saw it. Just a faint shape in the middle of the road, too small to be a person, too large to be an animal. I slowed down, squinting into the darkness. As my headlights got closer, I saw what it was. A doll. A small, old-fashioned porcelain doll in a frilly white dress, sitting upright in the middle of the empty road. My heart sank. There was no way to avoid it without swerving and risking a crash. I slowed to a crawl and drove right over it, feeling a small, sickening crunch under the wheels of my trailer. I felt a chill, a deep, profound coldness, even in the warmth of the cab. I had just run over a child's toy, a harmless porcelain doll, and I felt a sense of dread that was utterly disproportionate to the event. The unsettling feeling grew. A few miles down the road, I saw a flicker of white light on a rock. As I got closer, I saw it was the doll. It was sitting on a large, flat rock on the side of the highway. Facing me, its dress slightly torn, its little porcelain face unmarked. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my hands ached. It was impossible. There was no one else on this road. My mind, tired and frayed, tried to come up with 1,000 explanations. but none of them made sense. I hit the gas, determined to leave this terrifying coincidence behind. But the coincidences kept coming. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and I saw a reflection in the glass. The doll, sitting on the hood of my truck, its little porcelain head tilted to the side. I whipped my head forward, but my hood was empty. I looked in the mirror again, and the doll was gone. It was just an optical illusion, a trick of the light, I told myself. I felt a new coldness, a familiar chill, coming from the back of my cab. I heard a sound then, a faint, high-pitched giggle that seemed to echo in the dead silence of the truck. It was a child's laugh, light and airy, and it was coming from the back seat. The terror escalated into a full-blown panic. I was speeding down the road, my foot pressed to the floor, but the laughter was still there, now joined by the faint, rhythmic sound of a tapping, like a single fingernail on wood. Tap, tap, tap. I looked in my rearview mirror, and I saw a new detail. The curtains in the back of my cab, which were always tied back, were swaying gently, as if something was pushing on them from behind. The laughter was now a continuous high-pitched giggle, and the tapping was getting faster, more frantic. I felt a single, cold drop of something on the back of my neck. I froze. I was so terrified I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever was in the cab with me wasn't a hallucination. I looked into the rearview mirror, and in the faint light of the dashboard, I saw it. The doll? It was no longer in the back seat. It was sitting on top of my headrest, its frilly dress clean and pristine, its porcelain face turned to look at me. The laughter was coming from the doll, a quiet, almost soundless giggling that seemed to vibrate in the air. Its button eyes, which had been blank, seemed to now hold a terrible, ancient intelligence. The climax was a single, terrifying, final moment. The doll, its head turned to look at me, slowly began to move its little porcelain lips. There was no sound, but I could hear a single, high-pitched whisper in my mind, a cold, dry voice that said, "You can't leave me." Then, it slowly lifted its tiny porcelain hand, its fingers stained with what looked like black oily mud, and reached out toward my face. I screamed, a raw animal sound of pure, unadulterated terror. I veered the truck off the road, not caring about the sand or the rocks, my hands shaking on the wheel. I brought the rig to a screeching halt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I threw open the cab door and scrambled out, falling to the ground in a sobbing mess. I crawled on my hands and knees until I was a safe distance away. I looked back, and in the faint moonlight, I saw my rig. The cab door was open. I didn't see the doll, but I heard a single, final, high-pitched giggle come from inside. The cab door slowly, deliberately, began to swing shut on its own. I never went back to that truck. I left it there, in the middle of the desert, and I walked to the nearest town. I never drove a rig again. The memory of that doll still haunts me. I have no idea what it was, or what it wanted, but I know that some things, some objects, are not just things. They are vessels for something else, and when you drive alone in the dark, you risk becoming a new vessel for a soul that has been lost for a very, very long time. The open road. To some, it's a symbol of freedom. To a long-haul trucker, it's just the office. I've been driving rigs for 30 years, crisscrossing this country from coast to coast. You see a lot of things out there on the highways, and in the lonely rest stops, things you can't explain, things that stick with you. The vast majority of my nights are filled with nothing but the rhythm of the road, the drone of the engine, and the flickering lights of small towns passing in the rearview mirror. But every now and then, you encounter something that breaks that rhythm. Something that reminds you that out there, in the dark between the cities, there are things waiting. This happened about 15 years ago, on a desolate stretch of I-80 in Wyoming. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, and the plains were a black void under a cold, clear sky. I was pushing to make my delivery on time, so I had been driving for about 12 hours straight. My mind was in that half-conscious state you get into when you're driving late at night, focused on the road, but your thoughts are a million miles away. The first hint of something wrong was a flash in my peripheral vision. I'd just passed a billboard advertising a diner with a giant neon cowboy, and in the split second before it faded into the darkness, I saw something standing on the side of the road. It wasn't a person, not a hitchhiker. It was a tall, gaunt figure, its body a long, impossibly thin line, its head a mere silhouette against the starry sky. It was too fast to get a good look at, and in that instant, I told myself it was just a strange-looking tree or a trick of the light. I dismissed it, put on some music, and kept driving, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. About 20 minutes later, I saw it again. This time it was standing on a small embankment just off the shoulder, a few hundred yards ahead. It was still and silent, a dark slash against the pale gravel. I slowed down, my foot hovering over the brake, and as I got closer, I could see more detail. Its arms were long and spindly, hanging at its sides, and its head was tilted, as if it were watching me approach. The thing that made my blood run cold was the way it wasn't just standing there. It was swaying, a slow, unnatural motion, like a reed in a current. It wasn't a person. There was something profoundly wrong with its shape, its stillness. I hit the accelerator and drove past it as fast as I could. I was shaken, my heart pounding in my chest, but I was out of there, or so I thought. I tried to convince myself it was just a hallucination, a product of a tired mind. But as I kept driving, I started to notice something in my side mirror. A flicker of movement. I glanced over and saw a tiny, dark shape, a point of darkness against the empty highway, keeping pace with me. I was doing 70 miles an hour. It couldn't be. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The shape in the mirror grew. It wasn't a car. It was low to the ground, a single, black blur. As it got closer, I could see that it was the figure I had seen before, but it was running on all fours, its long limbs propelling it forward at an impossible speed. It was a hunched, spidery thing, and it was gaining on me. I slammed the accelerator to the floor, my speedometer climbing to 80, then 90. The needle on my fuel gauge was dropping fast, but I didn't care. The thing was still there, in my mirror, and I could hear a new sound over the drone of my engine. A faint, clicking noise, like 1,000 dry bones being rattled together. The clicking sound grew louder as the thing closed the distance. It was now directly behind my rig, and I could feel the vibrations of its movement through the floor of the cab. I took a quick glance in the mirror, and I saw a pair of pale, glowing eyes staring back at me. A pinprick of white light in the darkness. The climax arrived in a single, terrifying moment. The clicking sound stopped, and a new sound began, a soft, dry scratching against the back of my trailer. It was climbing. I could hear its movements above me, a rhythmic scrape and drag as it made its way toward the cab. My heart was a drum in my ears. I knew what was coming. I knew it was going to be at the side of my cab in a matter of seconds. I pulled my rig over, slamming on the brakes, the sound of the air brakes hissing as I skidded to a stop on the deserted shoulder. I grabbed my flashlight from the passenger seat, my hand shaking so hard I could barely hold it. I heard the scratching stop, and then a new sound, a soft, tapping noise against the roof of my cab, right above my head. I sat there, frozen, for a long minute. The tapping stopped. A single, long pause. Then I heard a new sound, coming from the passenger side window. Not a scratching, but a wet, slobbering sound. My headlamp was on the passenger seat, and its beam was now pointing directly at the window. As I watched in silent horror, I saw something begin to move in the corner of my vision. A hand, a long, spindly finger, tipped with a sharp, black claw, was slowly sliding down the outside of the glass. The hand was impossibly long, and as it moved, I saw the distorted reflection of a gaunt, skeletal face pressed against the glass. Its eyes, those pale, glowing pinpricks, were staring directly into mine. I screamed, not a controlled yell, but a raw animal sound of pure terror. I threw the gear into reverse and slammed the accelerator, not caring what was behind me. The sound of my tires spinning on the gravel was deafening. I drove backwards for 100 yards. Then I spun the wheel and pointed the rig back onto the highway, leaving my high beams on, leaving a trail of rubber on the asphalt. I drove until the sun came up, until the sky was a clear, comforting blue. I drove for 6 hours straight, not stopping, not looking in my mirrors. I never saw the creature again. I never told anyone what I saw, because who would believe me? I have no idea what it was, or what it wanted, but I know one thing: it was not human. I still drive that stretch of I-80, and I still get a cold chill every time I pass that spot. I never look in my side mirror. I can't, because sometimes when you're out there on the road, it's not the miles you have to worry about, it's the things that travel with them. I was on a run from Seattle to Boise, a route I've driven 100 times. It's a long haul, mostly interstate, but there's a 50-mile stretch of old 2-lane highway that's a real shortcut. It cuts through the forest in central Washington, a place where the trees grow so thick and tall they block out the sun, even in the middle of the day. It was late spring, and the rain was coming down in a steady, cold drizzle. I'd been driving for about 12 hours, and I was looking forward to a break. I was running a bit ahead of schedule, so I decided to stop at an old diner that sits right on the edge of that forest. The place is called the Timberline Grill, and it's one of those spots where you can get a real cup of coffee and a hot meal. When I pulled in, there was only one other vehicle in the parking lot, a faded beat-up pickup truck with Idaho plates. The place was empty, save for the old woman behind the counter and the trucker at a booth in the corner. I sat down at a table and ordered some pie and coffee. The trucker, a grizzled old-timer with a face like a road map, was staring out the window at the rain, just nursing a cup of coffee. I figured he was just like me, killing time and waiting out the weather. But as I watched him, I saw his eyes weren't focused on anything. They were just wide, staring at something that wasn't there. The first hint of unease was the way the old trucker reacted when I started to talk to him. I was trying to make small talk, just a friendly gesture, and I asked him if he'd been driving long. He didn't answer. He just slowly turned his head to look at me, and his eyes were full of a deep, profound fear. His voice, when it came, was a whisper. "Did you hear it?" he asked. I didn't know what he was talking about. I told him no. He shook his head and looked back out the window. "The knocking," he said. "The knocking on the roof." I just stared at him. I had no idea what he was talking about. He told me a story then, about a run he made through that very forest 2 nights before. He was on that same 2-lane highway, and it was dark and raining, just like it was now. He was pushing to make time when he heard it for the first time, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the roof of his cab. Not loud, but distinct. He told me he turned on the radio and cranked up the music, but he could still hear it, a faint, insistent sound over the drone of his engine. He thought it was a branch or a piece of his truck that had come loose, but he couldn't see anything. The old trucker's story grew more disturbing as he continued. He had been driving for another half hour, the tapping sound growing louder when he saw it in his rearview mirror. Something was clinging to the top of his trailer. It was a person, a woman, but her movements were all wrong. Her body was hunched over, Her arms and legs splayed out in an unnatural way, and her long black hair was plastered to her face by the rain. She was crawling slowly, painstakingly, toward the front of the trailer, toward his cab. The old man said. He slammed the brakes, hoping to shake her off, but she just held on, her body convulsing with each jolt. He told me he saw her face then, for a split second, as she came to a stop, just a few yards behind his cab. Her eyes were wide and white, her mouth a black hole of silent screaming. Her skin was a translucent, waxy white, and her fingers, impossibly long and thin, were digging into the metal of his trailer. He looked away, his hands shaking on the wheel, and floored it. The tapping came back, faster and more frantic now, as she scrambled to catch up. He drove for an hour, the sound of her frantic tapping and scraping on his roof, a constant, terrifying rhythm. He knew she was there. He could feel her presence, a cold, clammy feeling that seemed to seep into the cab. The climax of his story was terrifyingly simple. He said he had driven for hours, the tapping never stopping, never changing its rhythm. He finally had to pull into a rest stop, exhausted and terrified. He was too afraid to get out of the cab, so he just sat there, waiting for the sun to come up. As the first rays of light filtered through the trees, the tapping stopped. The old man waited a long time, and when he finally got out of the cab, he looked up at the roof. There was nothing there. No footprints, no scratches, no sign that anything had ever been on top of his truck. He walked to the back of the trailer and looked at the license plate. It was his own. He looked at his hands. They were caked with mud and grime, and there was a single, impossibly long, thin black hair caught between his thumb and index finger. It was the same hair from the woman he had seen on his trailer. He had carried her with him, all that way. He never told anyone. He just kept driving. He finished his story, and then he stood up and walked out of the diner without another word, leaving his coffee and pie untouched. I sat there alone for a long time, the old man's words echoing in my mind. I was supposed to be on my way, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. The rain had stopped, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. I paid for my pie and coffee, and walked out to my rig, and as I was about to get in, I saw it. On the roof of my cab, there was a single, long, thin, black hair, just like the old man had described. It was stuck in the sealant, where the roof met the side panel. It wasn't mine. I have no idea where it came from. I brushed it off, but I could feel my hands shaking. I got into my cab and started the engine, and as I was pulling out of the parking lot, I saw something in my side mirror, a flicker of movement. I didn't look. I couldn't. I just kept driving, and for the next 500 miles, every time a drop of rain hit my windshield, I felt a new, cold dread creep into my heart. The long, empty stretches of I-70 through Kansas are enough to make you feel like you're the only person left on the planet. I was on a multi-day run from Colorado to Indiana, and I was about 8 hours into the night portion of my drive. The cab of my rig was my entire world. The familiar drone of the engine, the glow of the dashboard lights, and the occasional flicker of a farmhouse light far off in the darkness. It was a comfortable solitude I'd grown used to over 10 years of driving. I had pulled over a few hours before at a tiny, dilapidated rest stop. Just a concrete slab with a single vending machine and a lone toilet building. I'd stretched my legs, grabbed a soda, and was back on the road in about 15 minutes. The moment I climbed back into the cab and shut the door, I felt it, a sudden, inexplicable coldness that made the hair on my arms stand up. I cranked the heat, but it didn't help. I was tired, and I told myself it was just the late-night chill getting to me. Then, I heard it. A single, distinct jingle, like a keychain being rattled, coming from the passenger seat. My heart thumped in my chest. I glanced over. Nothing. The seat was empty. I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks. The feeling of being watched started after that. It was a subtle, creeping sensation that made me check my mirrors every few minutes. I saw nothing, just the endless dark behind me. Then came the smell. It was a faint, musty odor, like old paper and dried flowers, and it seemed to be coming from the passenger side of the cab. I opened the window for a minute to let it air out, but when I closed it, the smell was still there, only stronger. I felt a chill on my neck, a distinct coldness, as if someone was breathing there. My heart started to race. My eyes flickered to the passenger side of the windshield, and for a split second, I saw a reflection in the glass. It wasn't my reflection. It was a distorted, faint outline of a head, its hair long and lank, its face a blur. The moment I looked directly at it, it vanished. I told myself it was my imagination, a result of staring at the highway for too long. I turned the radio up, trying to drown out the growing unease, but I could still hear it, a faint, rhythmic sound from the passenger seat. Not a jingle this time, but a soft, almost imperceptible clicking sound, like a loose set of teeth chattering. The terrifying encounters escalated as the night wore on. The clicking sound became louder, more insistent. My breath was visible in the cold air of the cab, even with the heat on full blast. I was now actively trying to ignore the coldness and the sounds, but I couldn't. I looked at the passenger seat, and I saw a subtle indentation on the cushion, as if someone was sitting there. The faint smell of musty flowers was now overpowering. I started to hear the whispers again, not just a jingle, but a low, sibilant sound right next to my ear. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was one of immense sadness and longing. I felt a presence, not just a coldness, but a weight. My truck's engine started to sputter, and I watched in disbelief as the dashboard lights began to flicker. I was running low on fuel, but not this low. The truck was losing power, slowing down, and I knew what was happening. It wasn't a mechanical failure. Something was draining the life from the vehicle. Something was in my cab with me. I gripped the steering wheel, my hands slick with sweat, and I started to plead out loud. Please, just let me go. I don't want to hurt you. I just want to finish my run. The sound of the whispers grew louder, and I could feel the coldness intensifying. A frigid weight settling onto my lap. The climax arrived with a sudden, horrifying clarity. My truck's engine sputtered one last time and died, and the entire rig went silent. The dashboard lights went out, leaving me in the pitch black. The only light came from the moon, casting a pale, cold glow into the cab. The whispers stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a single, cold, rattling gasp of air, right next to my ear. I was so terrified I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My eyes were wide open, staring into the darkness. A pale, waxy light, like a faint moonbeam, appeared on the dashboard. I watched as the light revealed something moving. A hand. Not a living hand, but a long, impossibly thin, skeletal hand. Its bones a ghostly white. It was reaching for my ignition. Its fingers were long and spindly, and from its wrist, a small bundle of old, rusty keys dangled, making a faint, chilling jingle. The hand came closer to the ignition, and as it did, I felt a new sensation, not cold, but a sudden, profound, and overwhelming sadness that felt like it was going to crush my soul. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated despair. I finally found my voice, and I whispered, "What do you want?" The hand paused for a second, then it reached toward me, and a cold, dry finger, tipped with a black, cracked nail, lightly touched my chin, tilting my head to face the passenger seat. I heard a single, clear, ancient whisper in my mind that sent a shock of icy terror through me. The voice was a woman's, and it was filled with unimaginable sorrow and a sense of being lost. It said, "You drove past my house. I didn't wait for more. I threw open the driver's side door and scrambled out of the cab, not caring about the traffic or the dark. I ran, blindly, until I was 100 yards from the rig. I looked back, and in the moonlight, I saw my truck, dark and silent on the side of the road. There was a single, solitary jingle that came from inside the cab, and then a faint, ghostly white light appeared in the passenger side window. It moved a slow, gentle wave of light, as if it were waving goodbye. I didn't get back in. I walked to the nearest town, and I called for a tow. I never told the mechanics what was wrong with the truck. I just told them it died. I still drive, but I avoid I-70. I also avoid rest stops, especially the ones that are out in the middle of nowhere. I still feel a coldness sometimes in the cab, a fleeting smell of old flowers. And every once in a while, when I'm alone in a silent room, I hear a faint, single jingle, a sound that reminds me that some passengers you pick up on the road never truly leave. The open road on a long solo drive is a strange place. You're alone, but you're connected to the rest of the world by a thin ribbon of asphalt. I was a few hours into a late-night drive across Colorado, heading west on a highway that winds through a long, desolate stretch of mountains and forests. It was about 1 in the morning, and the fatigue was starting to set in. The kind that makes the world feel like it's a million miles away. The only light came from my headlights, cutting through the thick, inky black of the pine forests that bordered the road. My phone had lost service a long time ago, and the silence in the car was only broken by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional sound of a semi-truck passing me in the other direction. I was in a comfortable rhythm, just driving, my mind drifting into a meditative state, but that meditation was about to be shattered. The first sign that something was wrong was a sudden jolt. I was just cresting a small hill when I saw a flicker of something in the road ahead. A small, crouched shape, like a deer, but lower to the ground. My heart leaped into my throat. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the slick asphalt. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty pavement. There was nothing there. No deer, no animal, nothing. I sat for a long minute, my hands shaking on the wheel, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was a hallucination, the result of too many hours on the road. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired. I took a deep breath, put the car in drive, and continued on. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, my senses on high alert. A few minutes later, as I passed a long, unbroken tree line, I saw it again, a quick, shadowy movement at the edge of the forest. It wasn't on the road this time. It was running parallel to me, a low-slung, hunched shape, keeping pace with my car. I was doing 60 miles an hour. It was impossible. The paranoia was a physical weight now, pressing down on my chest. I sped up, hoping to outrun whatever my mind was conjuring, but the feeling of being pursued only grew stronger. I glanced at my rearview mirror, and for a split second, I saw a pale, distorted face looking at me from the back seat. I screamed, but the sound was thin and choked. I whipped my head around, my eyes scanning the empty back seat. There was nothing. Just the familiar clutter of a travel bag and a jacket. I was losing my mind. But then I heard a sound, a faint, soft scratching, coming from the roof of the car. It was a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound, like a branch brushing against the metal. But there were no trees overhanging the road. I turned up the radio, but I could still hear it, a faint, insistent scraping. I looked at the glass in my sunroof, and I saw a new detail. There was a thin black line of something like dirt on the glass, as if something had just dragged a single, filthy finger across it. The sound grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel a cold vibration coming from the roof of my car. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was right above my head. The climax hit when the scraping stopped. It was so sudden and absolute that the silence was more terrifying than the noise. I was hyperventilating, my hands so tight on the steering wheel that my knuckles were white. The silence was broken by a single, sharp tapping sound coming from the windshield, right in front of my face. I looked up, and in the beam of my own headlights, I saw a reflection. It was the same hunched, low-slung shape I had seen in the forest, but now it was crouched on my hood, its face pressed against the windshield. It wasn't a person. Its body was a gaunt, skeletal thing, its skin a sickly pale white, stretched taut over impossibly sharp bones. Its long, spindly fingers were tipped with black, pointed claws, and one of them was tapping rhythmically on the glass. Its head was cocked to the side, its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Its eyes were two black, empty holes, and I could feel them staring directly into my soul. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stared, its mouth wide in a silent, horrifying smile, as if it were enjoying the taste of my terror. It was a predator, and I was its prey. I didn't wait for it to do anything else. I didn't care about the road or the fear of crashing. I put my foot down, the pedal hitting the floor. I didn't care about the swerving or the sound of the tires squealing. My only thought was to get away. I drove at top speed for what felt like an eternity, not looking in my rearview mirror, not daring to check the sunroof. When I finally reached a gas station, my car was a mess of dirt and grime, and there was a single, long, black scratch mark on the roof, as if something with claws had been clinging to it. I never drove that route again. I have no idea what that thing was, or where it came from. All I know is that when you're driving alone on a dark road, you're never truly alone, and every time I look at my rearview mirror, I still expect to see that pale, grinning face staring back at me. The thing about driving through the Midwest at night is the monotony. Mile after mile of cornfields, stretching to the horizon under a black sky. It's a hypnotic landscape, lulling you into a state of half-awareness, where the yellow lines on the road become your only reality. I was on a run through Adams County, Illinois, a long, straight stretch of highway that cuts through nothing but endless farmland. It was around 2 a.m., and I was on my own, just the hum of my rig and the sound of my own breathing. My mind was numb with fatigue, and I was just focused on making it to the next truck stop. But that night, the cornfields started to feel less like a backdrop and more like a presence. The first hint of something wrong was the radio. It wasn't just the static from losing a signal. It was a rhythmic, almost musical hiss, as if someone was tuning in to a frequency that wasn't meant for human ears. I fiddled with the dial, but the hissing just got louder. I finally just shut it off, leaving the cab in a deep, unsettling silence. The silence didn't last. I started to hear a low, dry rustling, like something was moving through the dense cornstalks, just beyond the road's shoulder. It was a sound that shouldn't have been there, a sound too deliberate and too close. I sped up, trying to get past it, but I could hear it getting faster, keeping pace with my truck. I told myself it was just the wind, but the air was still and heavy. Then I saw it. Just a quick, dark shape at the edge of my headlights. A flicker of movement within the rows of corn. It was low to the ground, moving quickly, and its limbs were too long and spindly to belong to a person. It was a hunched, spidery thing, and it was running parallel to my rig. The terror was a cold, physical thing now. I was doing 70 miles an hour, and the thing was still there, a shadow flitting between the stalks. The rustling sound grew louder, becoming a frantic, sharp scraping. I could feel a cold vibration coming from the floorboards of the cab. I looked out the window, trying to get a better look, and I saw a new, horrifying detail. The stalks of corn near the edge of the road, the ones closest to the running creature, were swaying and bending in an unnatural rhythm, as if they were turning to look at my truck. It was as if the entire field was watching me. The rustling from the corn was now a low, continuous whisper, a sound that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I slammed on the accelerator, hoping to outrun the thing in the fields, but it just kept pace. It was always there, a shadowy sentinel in the endless rows of corn. I knew I couldn't stop. I had to get away. The climax came when the thing stopped. I was rounding a slight curve in the road, my foot glued to the gas, when it suddenly came to a dead halt. It stood up, slowly, its impossibly long limbs unfolding until it was a gaunt, impossibly tall figure, towering over the cornstalks. My headlights illuminated it fully, and my breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't a person. It had a head of dried corn husks woven together, with a single, dark hole where a mouth should have been. Its body was a crude amalgamation of rotting burlap and twisted straw, and its arms were long, spindly things that ended in sharp, pointed fingers. In one of its hands, it held a small, crudely made effigy, a doll made of corn husks and bound with black string. The effigy was a miniature of me. The whispering from the cornfields swelled into a unified, terrifying chant, a sound of ancient, raw hunger. The creature tilted its head, and the effigy's little straw arms seemed to reach for me. Then, with a speed that defied logic, the creature began to run, not parallel to my rig, but directly at it, a horrifying, bounding sprint from the field toward the road. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound, and I floored it. The engine roared, and the truck lunged forward, but I was too close. The creature was at the edge of the road, and I braced myself for the impact. Just as I passed it, it launched itself, and with a high-pitched, agonizing scream that was too human to be from a monster, it threw the corn husk effigy at my windshield. It hit the glass with a wet, sickening thud and slid down, leaving a thick, black, oily smear in its wake. I drove on, not looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I saw a city sign on the horizon. I have no idea what that thing was, what it wanted, or what was in that effigy. The black smear on my windshield never came off, no matter how hard I tried to wash it, and to this day, when I drive past a cornfield at night, I roll up all the windows and turn up the music as loud as it will go. I can still hear, in my mind, that terrifying scream, and I know that in some places, the land doesn't just grow food, it grows something else. The worst part of driving alone isn't the physical solitude, it's the psychological isolation. It's the feeling that you are utterly disconnected from the world, a single tiny point of light in a sea of darkness. I was heading to a family cabin in Northern California, a long, winding drive through thick redwood forests and deserted country roads. My phone lost service miles back, and the GPS on my dashboard was just a blank screen. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning, and the silence in the car was absolute. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and my headlights were the only things cutting through the oppressive darkness. I was just focused on staying on the road, my mind numb with fatigue, when the impossible happened. A notification popped up on my phone's screen, which was mounted to the dashboard. It was a text message. A single, unread message. I had no service. My heart began to pound in my chest. I picked up the phone, my fingers shaking. The message was just a string of numbers and letters, a set of GPS coordinates. I stared at it, a cold dread washing over me. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as a fluke, a delayed message from a cell tower I had passed. But the screen flashed, and another text came in, this one with a different set of coordinates. I put the phone back down, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The silence was broken by the most terrifying sound I've ever heard on the road. The phone began to ring, not with my chosen ringtone, but with a thin, distorted, digital ring that sounded like it was being played through a broken speaker. The call was from an unknown number. I watched the screen flash, the number a long string of zeros. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just kept driving, my eyes glued to the road, my mind screaming with a silent, panicked terror. The fear was now a physical presence in the cab. The calls kept coming, one after another, each one from an unknown number. My phone's battery was at 100%, even though it had been at 20% when I started the drive. The text messages were coming in faster now, each one a new set of coordinates. I looked at the GPS, and I realized with a growing, cold horror that the coordinates were locations on the road I was on, locations I had just passed, or was about to pass. I started to see things then. A flicker of movement at the edge of my headlights, a shape running alongside my car, just out of sight. I sped up, but the movement kept pace. My phone rang again, and I answered this time, driven by a primal need to know what was on the other end. All I heard was a wet, heavy, dragging sound, like something was pulling itself through mud. It was a horrifying, sickening sound, and I slammed the phone down on the dashboard, hanging up. The call immediately started again. The sound of the dragging was now coming from outside my car, a low, rhythmic scrape and hiss that was keeping pace with me, just on the other side of my door. The climax arrived with a sudden, bone-chilling finality. My car's engine began to sputter, and the dashboard lights flickered and died. The car was slowing down, and I knew I was about to stop. The phone on the dashboard began to ring with a new, terrifying, pulsating rhythm. This time, the caller ID showed a name, The Road. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The dragging sound was now deafeningly loud, and a single, wet, raspy whisper came through the speaker. It said, "You passed me." I looked up, and my headlights, which were still on, illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road, directly in front of me. It wasn't a person. It was a gaunt, skeletal thing, its body covered in what looked like wet, black mud. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth was a gaping, toothless maw. It was holding an old, cracked cell phone to its head. The phone in my hand went silent. The call ended. The creature in the road began to move. It dropped its phone and started to crawl toward my car, a low, wet, dragging sound accompanying its terrifying, unnatural movements. I screamed, a primal, guttural sound, and slammed the car into reverse. I sped away, not caring about the road or the fear of crashing. I looked in my rearview mirror, and the figure was gone. I drove until the sun came up, until the sky was a clear, comforting blue. When I got to my destination, I threw my phone out the window and never looked back. I have no idea what that thing was, what it wanted, or why it was calling me. But I know that some things on the road don't just exist, they wait. And I know that it has my number. I never drive alone at night anymore, and I will never get another cell phone. Because every once in a while, when I'm alone in a silent room, I can still hear that thin, digital ring, and I know that somewhere, the phone is still ringing.